to review tomorrow, okay? All right, so before we start the science part, let me ask where what the last process was that you put in your journal. Was the last process that you wrote about in your journal condensation? Was it evaporation? Was it precipitation? Which one of those three was the last thing that you wrote about in your journal? Just send me a real quick chat with the word. The last thing you wrote about in your journal. Okay, so Kellen's at condensation. Thank you, Kellen. So Catalyst, when you did the water cycle, did you break it down into processes, or did you just do an overview of the whole thing? Same for you, Tamaya. And Isa, you didn't do water cycle. The last thing we wrote in our journals was condensation. So if you're talking, so I teach water cycle by breaking it down piece by piece. So in our journals, the first thing we talked about and wrote about was evaporation. And then the second thing we talked about and wrote about was condensation. So did you do the whole water cycle? So you've done everything? Evaporation, condensation, precipitation. Okay, thank you, Ariston. Okay, so it looks like all right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go back. For some of us, it's gonna be a go back. And some of us, it's gonna be a first time. So I had my kids doing 2-column notes. And we did that on evaporation and condensation. And so today we talked about the fact that evaporation is water that is gaining energy. And when it gains energy, it starts moving faster. So it breaks apart and it changes from a liquid to a gas. And that hot gas rises. So that's what we talked about in evaporation. And then we talked about how as it rises up into the atmosphere, it is much colder up there. And so it starts transferring its energy out and it loses energy because it's transferring its heat out. And when it does that, it starts condensing, which means coming back together, and it starts forming little water droplets. And those little water droplets hook together and form bigger water droplets. And those bigger water droplets hook together and form bigger water droplets. And that is what is forming the clouds, okay? So condensation takes place up in the sky where the clouds are. Evaporation takes place down on the Earth's surface, okay? So you need to kind of understand where in the cycle that's happening. So the last one is precipitation. So I'm going to put on the board a 2-column note, not with that one. Doesn't show up. There we go. 2 columns, one is smaller than the other. And in this side, we're writing it back. No, we're not. Screenshot. Precipitation. Okay, can you see what I wrote? Okay. So precipitation is water. Okay. Precipitation is neither the gaining or losing of energy. It doesn't do either one. Okay. It's about mass. when that water gets too heavy to stay in the cloud anymore, gravity pulls it to the ground. And when that water falls out of that cloud to the ground, that is called precipitation. Okay? Now, in 5th grade, we learn about 4 types of precipitation. And all of those types are dependent on air temperature. Okay? So there are 4 types. Okay? One is rain. That's the one everybody knows, right? So when water is too heavy to stay in the cloud, it falls down as rain. And that's what we get most of the time. We get rain. Rain happens anytime the temperature is above 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Okay? Anytime we have rain. Got it? Ground temperature is above that. Okay? Now, sometimes we have precipitation called snow. Okay? And snow is precipitation that happens when the clouds, the air up where the clouds are, and the ground level are both below 32 degrees or Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. So if the ground level is above 32, it's going to rain. Now it might have started as snow, but by the time it gets to the ground, it's rain because it's warm down here. Okay? Is that better? Or closer? Is it just not big enough, or is it the glare? So glare. All right, hold on just a second. Did that help? Harrison, did it help? How about that? Okay, all right. So snow, the air up at the top where the cloud is and the ground have to be 32 degrees or less for it to snow. Because if it's cold up here, but warm down here, it's going to melt and it's going to turn to rain. Okay? These are the 2 easy ones. The next one is sleet. So sleet starts as snow, melts on its way down, and then freezes again. So it starts cold where the cloud is, and it's coming as snow, it's ice crystals. And then as it comes down, there's a pocket of warm air that melts it, and then it gets close to the ground and it's cold again, and it freezes it again. That's sleet. Okay. And then there is one called hail. This is the one where those big chunks of ice fall out of the sky. And this is how those are made. So the rain, the air up where the cloud is cold. And then the drop falls and an air draft catches it and pushes it back up into that cold air, and it freezes. And then it falls and picks up some more water, and then it pushes it back up into the cold air and it freezes. And then it falls and catches some more water, and it pushes it back up into the air. And depending on how many times it falls and gets pushed back up and falls and gets pushed back up and falls and gets pushed back up, that's how big the ball is going to be. So if it only happens 100 times, you're going to have a little ball. We call that pea-size hail. If it happens 1,000 times, you're going to have a golf ball size hail. And if it happens 5,000 times, you're going to have grapefruit size hail. Okay? So it depends on how many times it falls and gets pushed back up into the cold and freezes, and falls and gets pushed back up in the cold and freezes. That is hail. All right? So air temperature is extremely important when you are talking about precipitation. And I will tell you right now that on your test, it's going to ask you, what would the temperature be like if you were seeing rain? Or it'll say, if it is 45 degrees Fahrenheit, are you going to see rain or snow? Okay, it's going to ask you about the temperature, because temperature is what determines what kind of precipitation you're going to get. Okay. Now, in the water cycle, precipitation follows condensation. All right. So, condensation follows evaporation. Precipitation follows condensation. So those are the three that you should have. You should now have those three main processes in your journal for water cycle. But we're going to talk about two other things that you need to know about the water cycle. And I'm going to do that by sharing my screen. So let me do that. Okay. So most of you should have seen this last week when you were talking about water cycle. And I'm going to turn this around and sit down so I can kind of, so I look like a person. Okay, so we talked about evaporation coming out of water, right? And we talked about transpiration is evaporation out of trees or plants. And we talked about, so that's down here by the earth, right? And then as you go up in the atmosphere, when it gets colder, you get condensation, which forms clouds, right? Water droplets stick together and form the clouds. And when the drops get too heavy to stay in the clouds, they come down as precipitation. Now look at these. What are these? They're raindrops. So is it warm or cold? Somebody turn their mic on and yell it. Warm or cold?
Warm.
It is warm. Raining. If these were snowflakes, it would be cold. Okay, got that? All right, so now the last two things that we're going to put in our journal about the water cycle that you are going to be tested on, so they're going to ask you questions about this, is what happens to the water when it gets back to earth. Okay? So, when water hits earth, a lot of times it hits the tops of the mountains first, right here. And it starts flowing down the mountains in the valleys of the mountains, right? And we call that runoff. So runoff, nope, not fog. Here we go. Runoff is nothing more than water running off the land surface. So like in my driveway, when it rains, there's just this stream of water that comes down because my driveway is on a hill. That is all runoff because it's just a stream of water coming down the hill. If you've ever driven down the side of the road when it's raining, you'll see the water all flowing, usually to the drains on the side of the road. That is runoff. So basically it is just that, running off. of anything that it touches, okay? So it runs down hills, it runs off your car, it runs off your house, your gutters take away the runoff. They keep it from falling on your head. So, that is the next, after precipitation, you're going to get runoff and it's going to run down. And it runs until it hits big streams or rivers. And those big streams and rivers then run into either a lake or a pond or an ocean, some body of water that is holding it, okay? So rivers are runoff, big runoff, and they follow a course, okay? So then the other things you're going to need to know about are surface water. So surface water is any water that's sitting on the surface. If you go out on the playground after it's rained and there is a puddle, that is surface water. It's sitting on the surface of the ground. That's pretty easy. So surface water sits on the ground. So a lake is surface water, a pond is surface water, the ocean is surface water, a puddle is surface water, okay? All that, surface water. The other one you have to know is groundwater. And groundwater is any water that sinks down into the earth. Give me a thumbs up if you have well water at your house. You don't get it from the city, you get it out of a well. Okay, so your well is groundwater. You are tapping into water that is stored under the ground and using it for your house. That's groundwater. Most of the city water is also groundwater, comes out of the ground. All right. So I'm going to stop this share and we are going to add these 3 things to our 2-column notes. All right. So draw a line right here. And we're going to put runoff, water, running across the ground. Okay. And then surface water is water sitting on the surface. Let's put the Earth's surface. That makes more sense. And some examples of that are lakes, ponds, oceans, puddles. Okay. Oh, and up here, rivers, streams, creeks, right? And then groundwater is water stored underground. So if you go in a cave and there's water, that's groundwater. Okay. There's water running under all of the Earth's surfaces. Call that a water table down there. You can tap into it. And in some places, the water table is really close to the surface, like in Florida. If you dig down 6 feet, you probably would hit the water table because it is sea level and it's very close to where the bottom of the ocean is, right? But if you go to Boone and try to dig down, the water table is probably 100, 150 feet, maybe even more than that, down below the surface because it's so high above sea level. So that water table can be in different places. All right, so does everybody have those notes? Give me a thumbs up or a yes on chat. Thank you, Isabella. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop. Did I stop my share? No, I'm not. I did. Okay, so I want to turn this around. Sorry if I give you motion sickness. I want to share one. I want to talk to you about your assignment for today. So here is what you are going to do today. So you're supposed to cut this apart and glue it back together, but that's kind of hard for you to do on an electronic device, right? So my suggestion to you is when you download this or open it with DocHub, you just write what these things are, okay? So here's the water. So something's happening going up from the water. Which part of the process is that, the water cycle is that? This is things moving into clouds. What part of the water cycle is that? And this is water coming down to the earth from the clouds. What part of the water process is that? So fill those in just by typing in there. Now on this part, you're supposed to cut these apart and put them in the right order. So here is my suggestion to you. You decide what happens first and put a 1 beside it. Type a 1. Happen second, type a 2 beside it. What happens third, type a 3 beside it. Okay? So that way we aren't cutting it apart. And I will just use your numbers to help me see if you have it in the right order. Okay? So they've given you some scenarios and you have to tell where they come, what happens first. And we're going to assume that the first, we're stepping, because the water cycle is something that never ends. It continually is going round and round and round and round. So we're going to assume that we're stepping into that at evaporation. Okay. And what is the first step in the water cycle, no matter what? What do we have to have for the water cycle to happen? Somebody turn the mic on and tell me.
The sun.
The sun. So we all know that the sun heating the earth is going to be number 1, right? So we all know this is going to be number 1. So then you have to decide what happens after the sun heats the earth, and that's number 2. All right? So there are your directions. And we're going to stop this share. I'm going to pause.